Aloha! This lecture is providing a broad overview to the discipline of sociology. Here is the outline for this lecture. We'll talk about what is sociology, the difference between the micro and macro level of analysis, the three main or classic theoretical perspectives for the discipline, as well as a brief review of the quantitative and qualitative research approaches. All right, so for those of you who have taken a sociology course, either in high school or an elective, you're probably familiar with the textbook definition of sociology, which is a great starting point, and your textbook has the textbook definition. But what I want to do here is review some of the key defining characteristics of sociology, which helps us to not only understand exactly what it is that sociology is and does, but also to better distinguish it from other disciplines. So sociology is the study of society, human social behavior, and social groups. Now this includes a lot. It really is just everything that you can possibly imagine and everything that you've also experienced in your own lifetime as a member of society. The next key characteristic of sociology is that it is a systematic study and analysis. So what this means, and we will focus on this more when we talk about research methods, is that sociologists utilize the scientific method, regardless of what kind of research they do, in order to collect data and observations, to observe patterns, and to generate knowledge for the discipline. So when we say that something is systematic, it means that there's a system in place, right? And one of the ways that we can think about that is the scientific method, right? And what this means is that it's not just random observations or personal opinions and experiences that informs the body of knowledge that makes up sociology. Now, a complementary thing to consider is this next point here, that sociology uses theory, and we use theory that's informed by empirical, so something that's observable. That's what empirical means, and systematic observations. So the research and the theory work together. There is a back and forth process that sociology, as well as other social sciences, utilize to create knowledge, keep it current and up to date, which is important because society is always changing. These changes are not always discernible and obvious, but it does change. The last point related to what I just said is that sociology is definitely incomplete in terms of what we know about society, right? And the kind of knowledge that sociologists generate is dynamic because people change. What is true about race and ethnicity 100 years ago is not necessarily relevant or applicable today. Much of it is, however, because our institutions change, laws change, cultural norms change, right? And this is why the study of sociology is always going to be necessarily incomplete and dynamic. Considering the characteristics of sociology that we just reviewed, I want to talk a little bit now about level of analysis. So one of the ways to approach the study of society is by determining what level of analysis you will take. So microsociology and macrosociology are one of the more basic, straightforward ways to approach this. Microsociology is taking up questions and considerations and topics where the focus is more on the day-to-day, face-to-face interactions that members of society, a community have. So one of the ways that we can think about how this level of analysis, this micro level of analysis, is relevant and applicable to today is to think about the way that the interactions that we have, say in a grocery store, while shopping, for anything, is that when you are a customer and you're interacting with someone who works in the store, whether it's the cashier, somebody who's stocking shelves, somebody at customer service, right, who will process returns and various kinds of issues that a customer may have experienced. Now, these all involve face-to-face interactions, and there are all kinds of taken for granted norms and rituals that we utilize in order to successfully complete these interactions, right? If any of you have worked in customer service, and even if you haven't, you probably have noticed by now that there is a really big emphasis on being cheerful when you work in customer service, right? Or hospitality as well, right? So what does this involve? Smiling. Lots and lots of smiling, right? Speaking with a particular tone of voice that's pleasant, maybe using certain expressions, right? And the customer can return those gestures with smiling, making small talk, that sort of thing, or not. So what's important here in this example is that the consequences are different for the employee versus the customer. So this is something that sociologists could observe, they could research, they could analyze. But specific to what's going on in the world today is the presence of face coverings, right? Wearing masks. And a question a sociologist who is interested in this micro level of analysis might create in order to study is, what are the effects of having these customer service interactions while wearing face masks, right? This is a situation that we all find ourselves in right now. And it's probably going to be here for a while. And this is an example and a way that we can think about how level of analysis is relevant to today. So the next point there, emphasizing the context where interactions take place. So just sticking with this example, that in the state of Hawaii, there have been mask mandates for quite some time. Now, this is not the case for every state. We also know that depending on the stores you go to, these rules and mandates may be enforced in very different ways, right? So this is what it means to say that context matters. So where these interactions are taking place matters, right? And so a sociologist who is taking this level of analysis is going to focus on data and have a preference for data where they can actually do the observations. So participant observation is essentially a researcher going to a research site, say like the grocery store or a hotel or the airport, and observing for a set period of time, making notes, right? And also complementing that with in-depth interviews. So in a nutshell, this is a way we can think of microsociology, and with a specific example of these interactions that we all have on a fairly regular basis that fall within the realm of customer service, and the ways that that has changed with all of these new protocols in place. So the mask mandate is one, but then there's also plastic barriers, right? Social distancing. We see stickers all over the place now, right? That's marking the 6 feet of distance. So macro sociology, on the other hand, is not interested and is not focusing on the face-to-face micro level types of interactions. Macro sociology is looking at systems, right? Focusing on the larger social dynamics. So we can still think about this issue of wearing masks at the macro level. And what that would look like would be comparing the mandates, the laws, and the penalties across the country, right? And you can look at it by state, you could look at it by region, and you may even start to consider, well, what is it about these states that the states that mandate masks versus the states that don't, what do they have in common, right? What kinds of patterns can we discern? So macro sociology is also going to emphasize social groups and institutions. So this could be anything like political affiliation, race, age, gender. Those are all examples of social groups that we belong to, where patterns exist. And institutions are things like education, family, government, law. So macro sociology, because of the scale of analysis it's taking, is going to tend to rely on more quantitative research methods and statistical analysis. So we can see here how both level analysis can study the same topic or the same issue, for example, mask wearing and mask mandates, but will take slightly different approaches. Now that we've covered what the micro and macro level of analysis entails in sociology, let's think a little bit about these 3 major paradigms. They're often referred to as the big 3, the classic sociological perspectives, which essentially just means that they are the older ones to be developed. And when we're thinking about perspectives and what a theoretical perspective entails, a useful way to think about it is through a lens, right? And that lenses, whether it is a prescription lens or something like sunglasses, whether they're tinted or clear or have some kind of other effect in them, that they will quite literally change our vision, right? And we can also think about it metaphorically because not everyone has vision, right? But the way we understand and interpret a particular situation in society. So the conflict perspective is a macro level perspective which emphasizes conflict between groups of people. This perspective is most associated with the work and writing of Karl Marx, and he focused on class conflict or class inequality. However, we also can extend this easily to other types of groups that make up societies. We can think about it in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of citizenship, in terms of religion, or any combination of those different types of group memberships that we have. So the conflict perspective is focusing at the macro level and the kind of conflict and inequality that exists between groups in society. Whereas the structural functionalist perspective, which is also a macro level perspective, is highlighting the way that the institutions within society, so education, family, government, the economy, thinking about how those all work together. Now, this doesn't mean that everything is perfect or that we're all living in harmony. But what the functionalist perspective is highlighting is that when there is a disruption, right, something happens like there's an economic crisis, that society will continue to function because that disruption is absorbed by the other institutions, right? So whereas the conflict perspective is really highlighting dysfunction and conflict and inequality between groups of people, the functionalist perspective is taking a different view, a different lens of the same types of scenarios that happen across societies over time and place, and looking and observing how different institutions will adjust, change, and absorb the disruption that can happen within a society. Now, of course, we're in a very particularly specific type of crisis right now because it is global. We are in a global pandemic. And while not all countries or even regions within countries are experiencing in the same way, the effects, both short and long term, are widespread. Some other examples we can think of that a functionalist perspective would consider and look at the ways that society absorbs the disruption, different institutions absorb the disruption, would be things like war, an extreme weather event, things of that nature. Our last perspective here, the symbolic interactionist perspective, is a micro-level perspective. So similar to the micro level of analysis previously discussed, this perspective is really focusing on and interested in face-to-face and small group interactions and how those interactions are fairly predictable because of the shared meaning that we attach to items. So an example of this going on right now, related to our previous example of mask wearing and mask mandates, is that the mask has taken on a completely new meaning over the past few months. If we were to travel back in time to a year ago or even 8 months ago, before COVID turned into a global pandemic, if we were to stop people on the street or in a busy restaurant or in a busy airport, remember those things? And ask them, what do you think of this mask? Most people probably wouldn't have very strong opinions on it, and they might not even know what it is or what it's for. But fast forward to today, given the broader global political, health, and economic circumstances, the meaning that we attach to masks has changed. There are those who view it as a necessary public health intervention. There are those who view it as a symbol of abiding by the rules, by the laws, of caring about those around you who you might interact with while you're out in public. And then there are those that view the mask as oppressive, restrictive, limiting their freedom, right? So there are, in a pretty short period of time, completely new meanings that are attached to the mask, which, on its own is either a piece of cloth or the disposal kind, the paper kind, right? And there's not really much to them. The meanings that we attach, though, are social, right? And this is what the symbolic interactionist perspective will pay attention to, examine, and study. All right, we have arrived to our final concepts for this brief overview of sociology that will serve as a foundation for the course and our work together, and that is of the quantitative and qualitative approaches. So if you recall, previously One of the key characteristics of sociology is that the discipline utilizes research, data, and observations to inform the body of knowledge that we have. The key takeaway for the purposes of this lecture is to understand the main difference between a quantitative versus a qualitative approach. A quantitative approach is most associated with survey research. Many of you have taken surveys, perhaps for extra credit, maybe even participated in constructing one, but you've also taken questionnaires, right, or customer satisfaction, surveys, and course evaluations, right? And those are all examples of tools to collect quantitative data. So the quantitative approach is going to be utilizing data that is already in numeric form, such as our age or income, or data that can be easily adapted and transformed into numeric form. A common way of doing this is using scale questions, also known as the Likert scale, which typically involves 5, sometimes 7 points on it. And it's going to be asking you to agree or disagree with various statements, positions, right? Where essentially what's being measured is the respondent's opinions or feelings about a particular topic. So that's what the quantitative approach and quantitative researchers are going to be working with primarily. And that's the kind of data they're going to be interested in collecting. The qualitative approach, on the other hand, is collecting data and observations that are not easily quantifiable, or the researcher does not want to quantify them. So this looks like interview data. The purpose of interviews is to get more information that's more rich in detail and nuanced than a quantitative survey would allow for. Observations that could include ethnography or participant observation, as well as images that a researcher can conduct a content analysis on. So examples of things that sociologists have conducted qualitative content analysis on would be commercials, ads, headlines in the newspaper, and the language that's used to describe different groups of people. So qualitative research and quantitative research have different aims and goals and will therefore use different methods to collect different kinds of data. And we will focus more on that as we cover research methods. So this is the end of the broad overview lecture. We talked about what is sociology, focusing specifically on the main characteristics of it, the difference between micro and macro level analysis, the 3 sociological perspectives, as well as these 2 different research approaches.